The second cup was never touched, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome, dear listeners. There is something about late spring in an English village. The roses just opening, the church hall already smelling of paint and string for the flower show. Everyone has a reason to be in everyone else's garden this week, and nobody thinks to ask why. Tonight we go to little Hindwell, where an old schoolmistress pours her own afternoon tea, alone, the way she has every day for 30 years. Before we go any further, I would like to know who is listening with me tonight. Are you at home after a long day, on a night shift, stealing a quiet half hour, retired, with the garden finally quiet? Perhaps your hands are busy with something else while this plays. Ironing, washing up, knitting. Tell me below. I read every comment. Now, the kettle is on. Let us go in. Chapter 1. Flower Show Week. Miss Hatching counted the same column of figures 3 times before she let herself believe it. The flower show entry money was 4 shillings short, and she did not like being 4 shillings short of anything, least of all in a tin box she alone was responsible for. She looked up when the bell over the post office door gave its small complaint. Miss Jane Marple came in shaking a few drops of rain from an umbrella that had clearly seen the inside of more than one English summer. "Good morning, Miss Hatching. I've brought the parish magazine subscriptions. Mrs. Tolt asked me to drop them in, rather than have her walk down in this." Miss Marple set a small bundle of envelopes on the counter, each one addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand. "Thank you, miss." Miss Hatching took them and did not look up again right away. Her eyes had gone back to the tin box. "Is something the matter?" "It's nothing. Only the show money doesn't add up, and Miss Pebmarsh will want to know why the moment she comes in to check it, which she does every single day at 10:30, rain or no rain." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted very slightly, the way they did when a small fact arranged itself somewhere behind her pale blue eyes. "Constance always was particular about figures. She taught me long division when I was no taller than this counter, and I have never forgotten it, much against my own preference. She taught half the village its sums, miss, and never lets us forget it neither." Miss Hatching said this with the particular fondness people reserve for someone they are slightly afraid of. There she is now, I'd wager. 10:30 on the dot. The bell rang again, and Constance Pebmarsh came in with the brisk, upright walk of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding the attention of small children and had never quite stopped. She was 58, grey-haired, dressed in serviceable tweed despite the warmth of the morning, and she carried a clipboard the way other women carried handbags. "Good morning, Miss Hatching. Good morning, Jane." She set the clipboard on the counter with a small definite tap. "I have the final list of flower show categories. I trust the entry forms have gone out to everyone on the list, and not merely the ones who remembered to ask twice." "They've gone out, Miss Pebmarsh." Miss Hatching's voice had taken on the particular flatness of someone repeating herself for the 3rd time that week. "Good. Because last year Mrs. Frith's gardener entered the dahlias under the wrong class entirely, and I had to have the whole thing reorganized at 11 o'clock the night before. I will not have a repeat performance." Constance turned her attention to Miss Marple. "Jane, you'll judge the sweet peas again this year. You have a good eye and, more importantly, no garden of your own in this village to create a conflict of interest." "I should be glad to, Constance. Though I warn you, Mrs. Sopworth will tell everyone I favoured the vicarage entry, regardless of what I actually decide. Mrs. Sopworth says that every year. It has never once been true." Constance picked up her clipboard again. "I am going to see Miss Allardyce about the rose judging. She has some notion that the schedule ought to change, and I intend to disabuse her of it before she sets the whole committee fighting over nothing." She left as briskly as she had come, the bell announcing her departure with the same small complaint. Miss Hatching exhaled. "She'll have poor Miss Allardyce in tears before lunch. Constance has never been unkind exactly." Miss Marple was watching the door, though there was nothing to see through it now but the high street and a delivery boy wobbling past on a bicycle too large for him. Only certain of herself, It is not always a comfortable quality in a small place, where everyone else must be certain of something different to get along at all. You sound as if you're worried about her, miss. Not worried. Miss Marple paused, as if considering whether that was entirely accurate, and decided, for the moment, that it was. Only thinking that a woman so certain of everything is sometimes the last to notice when something around her has gone quietly wrong. She did not say what she meant by this, and Miss Hatching, who had 4 shillings still unaccounted for and a queue forming behind her, did not ask. At the ironmonger's shop 2 doors down, Walter Greer was doing sums of his own, and his did not balance any better than the post office till. He sat in the back room among coils of rope and boxes of nails with a letter open on the desk in front of him. It was from a solicitor's firm in the county town, and it was not friendly. It gave him a fortnight to settle an account that he had been quietly extending for the better part of 2 years, an account secured against stock he had, in point of fact, already sold twice over in different directions to keep the bank from asking questions. He read it again, though he knew every word of it by now, and then folded it small and put it in his waistcoat pocket rather than the desk drawer, where his wife sometimes looked when she was hunting for string. The shop bell rang. He came through to find Edith standing at the counter with the ledger book open in front of her. The real one, the one he kept for the bank, not the one he kept in his head. "Walter, I cannot make this column come right at all. We've taken in less this quarter than last, and yet you've been ordering more stock than ever. Where is it all going? Bad season for ironmongery, Edith. Everyone's spending on the flower show instead. It'll pick up." He took the ledger from her with a smoothness that had taken him 2 years to perfect. "Leave the books to me. You've enough to do with the W.I. stall." Edith looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, the way a wife looks at a husband she has decided, for now, to believe. "You went up to Aunt Constance's yesterday," she said. "What did she want?" "Nothing in particular. Asked after the shop, asked after you. The usual." Walter closed the ledger and set it under the counter, out of reach. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Only she telephoned here Tuesday and asked when you were next free to call, and that's not like her. She generally just expects people to fit round her own time, not the other way about." Edith picked up her basket. "I'll be at the hall till 4, sorting the produce table." She left, and Walter stood behind his own counter for a long moment, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of the high street, a dog barking somewhere, the postman's bicycle bell, and underneath all of it, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he very much did not want to finish. Chapter 2. The Foxglove Border. Constance Pebmarsh's cottage stood at the end of the lane behind the church, with a garden that was the pride and occasionally the terror of the village, since she judged her neighbours' boarders by the same exacting standard she applied to their children's handwriting. Hartley, who gardened for the manor 3 days a week and for Constance on the other 2, was on his knees by the kitchen door when Miss Marple came round to return a book. "Afternoon, miss." He did not look up from the trowel. "Mind the path. It's wet from the rain still." "Thank you, Hartley. Those are lovely this year." She nodded toward a tall stand of foxgloves, purple and white, leaning handsomely against the wall just by the kitchen door. "Moved them there myself, back in March. Used to be down by the wall at the bottom, but the slugs were having a feast on the delphiniums next to them, so I brought the foxgloves up here where the ground's drier and put something else down there instead." Hartley sat back on his heels. Miss Pebmarsh didn't mind, said as long as they flowered for the show, she didn't care where they stood. Very sensible of her, though I confess I've never quite trusted a foxglove near a kitchen door. They're handsome, but there's no part of them I'd want anywhere near a teapot. "No, miss, nor me." Hartley went back to his weeding, and the matter, as far as he was concerned, was finished. Miss Marple went on round to the front of the cottage, where Constance was sitting at the open window of her sitting-room with a stack of correspondence and an expression that suggested at least one letter in the pile had displeased her. "Jane, come in, since you're here. I want a second opinion, and you're the only person in this village whose opinion I trust not to simply agree with whatever I've already decided. That sounds like a very particular kind of compliment, Constance. It's the only kind I give. Constance gestured to the chair opposite. I've had a most unsatisfactory letter from my solicitor. He's drawn up the changes to my will exactly as I asked, but he insists I come in and sign properly, rather than simply post the thing back, which means a trip into town I had rather not make this week, with the show only days off. Changes of a serious kind. Serious enough. Constance's mouth set in the particular line that her former pupils would have recognized from 30 years of being told their sums were wrong. I have been too generous in the past with people who have given me very little reason to deserve it. I intend to correct that. I shan't say more, Jane, not even to you, until it's signed and done. There's no sense announcing a thing before it's certain, and I have learned that lesson the hard way more than once in this village. You needn't say anything at all, Constance. It's your business entirely. I know it is. I only mention it because you have a way of looking at a person as though you already know half their business, regardless of whether they've told you, and I'd rather you heard it from me first, when the time comes, than worked it out on your own and said nothing. Constance folded the letter away. Now, tell me honestly, do you think Miss Allardyce has any real grievance about the Rose schedule? Or is she simply still smarting because I corrected her arithmetic in front of the whole committee in March? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that it is very hard to forgive someone who taught you that 2 and 2 make 4, when that same someone goes on, 30 years later, still telling you what you've got wrong. Constance gave a short laugh, more surprised than offended. You may be entirely right. Well, she shall simply have to bear it. The schedule stays as I've set it. Outside, in the lane, a small girl of about 11 was crouched by the hedge with a jam jar, hunting for something that had got away from her, a beetle or a frog, and she looked up just long enough to see Walter Greer's van pull away from the cottage gate at a speed rather faster than the lane usually saw, before going back to her hunting and forgetting the whole thing as completely as children forget anything that does not involve jam jars or beetles. Her name was Polly Frith, and she would not think of the van again for some days, by which time it would matter rather more than she could have guessed. Chapter 3. The Second Cup. It was Constance Pebmarsh's habit, every afternoon of her life for as long as anyone in Little Hindwell could remember, to take tea alone at 4:30 after whatever visitor she had entertained earlier had gone, and to pour herself a second cup some 20 minutes after the first, which she drank slowly while she went through the day's correspondence one final time before supper. On the Tuesday before the flower show, Dr. Sandys came to call at 4, ostensibly about her heart, which had given her some trouble the previous winter, though the visit ran more to gossip about the Rose schedule than to medicine, since Constance considered her own health a settled matter requiring no further discussion. "You're sounding stronger than you were in February," Dr. Sandys said, folding his stethoscope away, "though I'd still ask you to go easy on yourself this week. The show is a great deal of excitement for anyone, let alone someone with your heart history." "My heart," Dr. Sandys, "has carried me through 58 years and 40 of teaching other people's children. I expect it can manage one flower show." He left at 4:30, smiling in the particular resigned way of a man who had long since given up arguing with his most stubborn patient, and Constance settled into her usual chair by the window, with the teapot still warm beside her. She poured her first cup and drank it as she always did, reading through a letter from the diocesan office about the church fete accounts. The second cup she poured some 20 minutes later, just as the church clock struck the quarter hour, and this was the cup she did not finish. Mrs. Fruin, the doctor's housekeeper, found her the next morning when she called round with a jar of the doctor's own gooseberry jam, a small kindness Constance had never asked for, and never quite managed to refuse either. The teapot was still on the table. The first cup, washed and put away as Constance always did the moment she finished it, sat clean on the draining board. The second cup stood half full and cold on the side table, exactly where Constance had set it down, beside the chair where she had been found, her correspondence still in her lap, her reading glasses still on her nose. Dr. Sandys came at a run, though there was nothing left to run for. He examined her with the particular gentleness of a man who has known a patient for 15 years and is now obliged to treat her as nothing more than a body. "Her heart," he said to Mrs. Fruin, who stood wringing her hands in the doorway. "I always feared it would be her heart in the end. She would never slow down, whatever I told her." It was, on the face of it, exactly the death the whole village had half expected for years. The schoolmistress's heart finally giving out after one warning too many ignored. Dr. Sandys signed what he believed to be true, and the village, when the news went round by the usual channels of post office and pew and pub, received it with the particular mixture of shock and unsurprise reserved for a death long anticipated and yet somehow still sudden when it comes. Only the second cup, cold and half full on the side table, sat for a moment in Dr. Sandys's notice before he set it aside with the rest of the clearing up. A small, ordinary thing, no more remarkable, he thought, than anything else in a dead woman's sitting room. He was wrong about that, though it would be some days before anyone, even Miss Marple, understood quite how wrong. Chapter 4. A Heart Long Expected. The funeral was arranged for the Friday, which put it inconveniently close to the flower show on the Saturday, a fact that several people in the village mentioned in tones of genuine regret, since Constance herself would have been the first to object to any disruption of her own schedule. Miss Marple attended in the dark coat she kept for such occasions and sat near the back of the church, where she could see most of the village without appearing to watch any of it in particular. Reverend Tolt gave a sermon that was kind without being false, mentioning Constance's 40 years in the schoolroom and her tireless work for the flower show committee, and avoiding, with the tact of a man who had buried a good many difficult parishioners, any mention of how many of those 40 years had been spent making other people feel smaller than they wished to feel. Afterward, in the churchyard, the village gathered in its usual clusters. A heart attack, Dr. Sandys says. Mrs. Sopworth had positioned herself by the lich gate, where she could observe the whole churchyard at once, a habit of some 30 years standing. "Well, we all knew it would come to that eventually. She never would slow down. She taught my Tom his letters," said Tom Buckle, the landlord of the Crown, standing nearby with his hands folded in the particular awkward way of a large man at a funeral. "Hard as nails she was, but fair. He reads better than I do now, thanks to her." "Fair to some," said Miss Allardyce, who had come in a black coat a shade too smart for the occasion, and stood slightly apart from the main group. She was not always fair to everyone. Mrs. Tolt, the vicar's wife, who made it her quiet business to know the temperature of every conversation in the churchyard, drifted toward this particular knot of people with the air of someone merely passing. "I heard she'd had words with you about the rose schedule, Miss Allardyce," she said, gently enough that it did not quite sound like prying, though it was. "Words is one way of putting it." Miss Allardyce's chin came up. "I won't pretend I'm sorry. The schedule will go ahead, as I think it ought to now, but I am sorry for the manner of it. Nobody deserves to die alone over their own teapot, whatever else they were." It was an odd thing to say, and Mrs. Tolt filed it away, as she filed away most things said in churchyards, for later consideration. Walter Greer stood with Edith a little apart from the others, accepting condolences with the stiff, correct expression of a man who has rehearsed grief without quite feeling it yet. "She was very fond of you, Walter," said the Colonel's wife, Mrs. Frith, pressing his hand. "Always spoke well of you, whatever people say about nephews and aunts." "She was very good to me," Walter said, and this, at least, was entirely true, which made it easier to say than almost anything else he had said that week. Edith watched her husband's face while he said it, and something in her own expression suggested she had noticed, without yet being able to name, that he said it the way a man says something he has decided to believe, rather than something he has simply found to be so. Miss Marple walked home from the funeral with Dr. Sandys, who had offered her his arm over the uneven churchyard path, more from old habit than any real necessity. You knew her heart history better than anyone, Doctor. Were you entirely satisfied, in your own mind, that it was her heart and nothing more? He glanced at her, the question landing with slightly more weight than such questions usually carried from Miss Marple, though he had known her long enough to recognize that her questions rarely carried less weight than they seemed to. I had no reason to think otherwise. She had a weak heart, confirmed by examination, known to me for years. She was found exactly as a woman with her condition might be expected to be found, in her chair, with no sign of struggle or distress beyond what the collapse itself would cause. He paused. Why do you ask, Jane? No particular reason. Only that Constance was the sort of woman who arranged everything in her life so precisely that even her own death seems, to me, to have arrived rather more conveniently for somebody than such things generally do. Dr. Sandys considered this for the length of several paces. That's a strange way to put it. It is rather, isn't it? I expect it's nothing. Miss Marple did not say that she expected nothing of the sort, and Dr. Sandys, who had learned over many years not to take Miss Marple entirely at her word when she said a thing was nothing, walked the rest of the way in a silence that was not quite as comfortable as it had been before. Chapter 5. What Miss Hatching read twice. The post office on the morning after the funeral was busier than usual, since everyone in the village had found some small errand that brought them past the counter, ostensibly for stamps or string, in fact for news. Miss Hatching, who read every postcard that passed through her hands as a simple matter of professional thoroughness, had also, on the Tuesday before Constance died, read a letter twice. It was not strictly her business to do so, since the envelope had been properly sealed, but a letter from a solicitor's office, addressed in Constance Pebmarsh's own decisive hand to her own solicitor in the county town, was not the sort of thing Miss Hatching's eye passed over without lingering, and the postmark on the return letter, arrived only the day Constance died, had lingered in her mind rather longer than the letter itself had been in her hands. She had not opened it. She wished to be quite clear with herself on that point, but the franking on the outside had given a strong suggestion of its origin, and a woman who had spent 20 years sorting other people's correspondence developed, over time, a fair instinct for which letters concerned wills and which concerned nothing more interesting than a subscription renewal. She was changing her will, Miss Hatching told Mrs. Sopworth, who had come in for stamps she did not strictly need. I'd stake my position on it. A letter went out to her solicitor not 3 weeks back, and one came back the very day she died. Mrs. Sopworth, whose window seat commanded a view of the High Street that she had occupied so faithfully for so many years that several of the younger villagers genuinely believed she had been born there, received this information with the particular gravity of a woman about to perform an important public service. Changing her will, she repeated to Miss Carraway at the W.I. stall not an hour later, and everyone knows she'd no family of her own to speak of beyond Walter, so it stands to reason she meant to leave it all to the church, the way these old spinsters so often do when they've nobody closer. Miss Carraway, arranging gladioli for the produce table, took this in with interest and passed it along, by the end of the afternoon, to no fewer than 4 other people, by which point the story had acquired a confidence and a specificity, leaving it all to the church, that bore only a loose relationship to anything Miss Hatching had actually said, and none whatever to anything Constance Pebmarsh had actually decided. The truth, which only Constance's solicitor and, in a general sense, Walter himself knew with any certainty, was rather different and rather more dangerous to one particular person than the church ever could have been. Walter had not meant to overhear it. He had called at the cottage 3 weeks before, on an ordinary errand about a guttering pipe that wanted fixing, and Constance had been on the telephone in the hall, her voice carrying the particular crispness she used for business of any importance. Yes, exactly as I said. Certain provisions need to be reconsidered entirely, given what I have learned. No, I shan't go into it on the telephone. Send the papers, and I will sign when I am satisfied they say precisely what I intend. A pause. No, Mr. Endicott, I am quite decided. There is no sense being sentimental about money that has been mismanaged behind my back." She had rung off and come through to find Walter standing rather too still by the hall table, and had said nothing further about it. Beyond a brisk, "The guttering is round the back, Walter, where it has always been," as though nothing at all had passed. He had driven home that evening with his hands tighter on the wheel than the road required, turning over in his mind exactly how much his aunt might have learned, and from whom, and how much of his arrangement with his creditor she might somehow have heard of, in a village where Miss Hatching read every letter twice and Mrs. Sopworth saw every van that passed her window. He had told himself, for nearly 3 weeks, that it was nothing, that Constance could not possibly know the particulars, that she was simply tidying up an old will the way old women did. He had gone on telling himself this right up until the morning the solicitor's letter arrived at his own shop, giving him a fortnight to settle a debt he had no possible means of settling, and he had understood, reading it over the ironmonger's counter with his wife's footsteps coming down the stairs above him, that he had perhaps 3 weeks left before the only thing standing between himself and total ruin was quietly and irrevocably removed from him by his aunt's own decisive hand. Chapter 6. The Quarrel about the Roses. The Flower Show Committee met on the Wednesday evening in the church hall, ostensibly to finalize arrangements now thrown into disarray by Constance's death. In fact, to argue, since a committee deprived of its most forceful member rarely settles anything quietly on the first attempt. "I still say the rose schedule ought to follow my arrangement," Miss Allardyce said, for perhaps the 3rd time, to a room that had heard her say it twice already that evening. Constance changed it at the very last moment, out of pure stubbornness, and there's no reason now to honour a change made for no better reason than spite. "It hardly seems the moment to revisit old quarrels, Miss Allardyce," said Reverend Tolt, with the gentle firmness of a man who chaired a great many meetings and had learned that gentleness alone rarely carried a point. "The poor woman is barely in her grave. I am not trying to be unkind to her memory. I am trying to see the show run properly, which is rather what she would have wanted, whatever else one says of her." Miss Allardyce's colour was up. "We quarrelled about the schedule not 3 days before she died, in front of half this committee, and I won't pretend otherwise, simply because it looks awkward now." "Nobody is suggesting you pretend otherwise," Miss Marple said mildly, from her chair near the window. "It would be a great deal stranger, I think, if you said nothing at all about a disagreement that several people here witnessed firsthand. Pretending a thing did not happen rarely makes it look better, only more suspicious." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence, into which Mrs. Tolt offered tea with the particular speed of a vicar's wife who has spent years smoothing over exactly this kind of moment. Miss Allardyce took her cup with hands that were not entirely steady. "I quarrelled with her about roses, Miss Marple. I did not kill her over them." "No one has suggested you did," Miss Marple said, and meant it, though she noted, as she always noted such things, the particular vehemence with which the denial had been offered before anyone had thought to make the accusation aloud. The meeting limped on to its proper business, the schedule eventually settled by a vote that left nobody entirely satisfied, and broke up a little after 9, the committee filing out into a lane already growing dim with the long blue evening of late May. Outside, Mrs. Dunnow, who had taken the end cottage 2 years before and remained, in the village's collective estimation, a newcomer despite this, was waiting at the gate for her bicycle, which she had left leaning against the wall during the meeting, though she had not, in fact, attended it. "Good evening, Miss Marple." She fell into step as Miss Marple began the short walk back toward the vicarage, where she was staying that week. "I confess, I only came to collect a flower show entry form Mrs. Tolt promised to leave for me. I haven't the stomach for committee meetings, particularly not this week." "It was a rather warm one this evening, I'm afraid. I heard some of it through the window. Poor Miss Allardyce." Mrs. Dunnow's tone suggested genuine sympathy rather than mere politeness. "It seems unkind that people should be made to account for an ordinary quarrel just because someone happened to die soon after having it." "It does seem unkind," Miss Marple agreed, "though I have noticed, over a good many years, that an ordinary quarrel followed soon after by a death is precisely the sort of thing a village finds it hardest to leave alone, however unfair that may be to the person who quarrelled." Mrs. Dunnow looked at her sideways in the dimming light, an expression Miss Marple could not entirely read, somewhere between unease and something almost like recognition, before she said good night, rather more abruptly than the conversation seemed to warrant, and wheeled her bicycle off down the lane toward her own cottage, leaving Miss Marple to walk the rest of the way to the vicarage alone, turning over in her mind the particular weight of things people said when they believed themselves merely making conversation. Chapter 7. Polly's Coat. Polly Frith was 11 years old and had the particular gift, common to children of that age and largely wasted on the adults around them, of noticing everything and understanding almost none of it. She told her grandmother about the van quite by accident, 3 days after the funeral, while the two of them were shelling peas on the terrace at the manor. "There was a van outside Miss Pebmarsh's gate the day before she died. I saw it from the hedge when I was after my beetle." "Whose van, dear?" Mrs. Frith asked this without much real interest, her attention mostly on the peas. "I don't know whose. Green, with a name on the side I couldn't read from where I was. It went off very fast, faster than vans usually go in our lane." Polly considered this further. "And there was a man, too, by the gate before the van went, only I didn't see his face properly because of the hedge, just his coat. Brown, like Mr. Greer's, only I don't think it was him because Mr. Greer wears his ironmonger's coat in the shop, not that brown one." Mrs. Frith, who had a long memory for the kind of thing that mattered in a village and very little patience for the kind of thing that did not, filed this away under things not worth repeating and went back to her peas. But the Colonel, who had come out onto the terrace in time to catch the end of it, repeated it that same evening to Mrs. Tolt over the church accounts, in the idle way men repeat things their granddaughters say, expecting no particular consequence from it. By the time it reached Mrs. Sopworth's window the following morning, by way of Mrs. Tolt stopping briefly at the post office, the story had simplified itself considerably, as gossip in Little Hindwell generally did, shedding its uncertain edges in favour of something with more shape. "A stranger seen at Miss Pebmarsh's gate the very afternoon she died," Mrs. Sopworth reported to anyone who passed within range of her window that morning. "And who do we know in this village who is still, in any real sense, a stranger, whatever airs she gives herself about having been here 2 years?" It did not take very long for the unspoken name to attach itself to Mrs. Dunnow, who had no family in the village to vouch for her history, no long-standing friendships to soften suspicion, and the particular misfortune of having been seen by no less reliable a witness than Miss Hatching herself, walking in the lane near Constance's cottage on the very afternoon in question, on an errand that had nothing whatever to do with anyone's death and everything to do with a library book she was returning to Constance, who had lent it to her some weeks before. Mrs. Dunnow knew nothing of any of this until Tom Buckle, not unkindly, mentioned it to her over the counter of the Crown when she came in for her usual half-bottle of sherry. "There's talk, that's all, Mrs. Dunnow. I shouldn't pay it any mind myself, but you ought to know it's going round, about you being seen near the cottage the day Miss Pebmarsh died." "I returned a book, Mr. Buckle. That is the whole of what I did near that cottage." Her voice, when she said this, had gone thinner and tighter than she perhaps intended. "I don't suppose anyone in this village will trouble to remember that part of it." "I don't suppose they will," Tom agreed, with the particular regretful honesty of a landlord who had watched a great many true things lose out to a great many better stories over the years. "It isn't fair, but there it is." Miss Marple heard the story in its fullest, most distorted form from Mrs. Tolt over breakfast at the vicarage, and listened to the whole of it without comment until Mrs. Tolt had quite finished. "You don't seem very alarmed, Jane." "I am rarely alarmed by gossip, Margaret, only interested in how it travelled. A van, seen by a child through a hedge, has become a stranger, seen at a gate, has become Mrs. Dunnow, who was in fact 100 yards further up the lane on an entirely different errand, at, I should think, a rather different time of the afternoon than the van was there at all. Miss Marple buttered her toast with the unhurried care of someone thinking about something else entirely. It is a very good illustration, I find, of how a true thing and a false thing can travel along exactly the same road and arrive at quite different doors. You think the van matters more than Mrs. Dunnow, then? I think, Miss Marple said, that a brown coat glimpsed through a hedge by a child more interested in beetles than in coats is a far more interesting fact than anything Mrs. Dunnow did or did not do near a cottage on an entirely innocent errand. Children rarely invent the colour of a thing. They simply fail to understand its importance. Chapter 8. The Shop's Accounts. Edith Greer had not slept well in some days, and not entirely on account of grief, since her aunt by marriage had never been a woman who invited deep affection, only respect of the wary kind. She had gone through the shop ledger again on the Thursday night, after Walter had gone up to bed, and had found, on a closer look than she had previously troubled to give it, 3 separate entries for stock she distinctly remembered seeing sold from the shop floor weeks before the ledger recorded the purchase of it at all, an impossibility that made sense only if the same stock had somehow been bought, sold, and bought again, or if the books themselves had simply stopped telling the truth some time ago. She said nothing to Walter about it directly. Instead, on the Friday morning, she walked down to the post office and asked Miss Hatching, in the roundabout way one asks a question one does not quite want answered, whether anyone had been round lately, asking after the shop standing. Not that I've heard, Mrs. Greer, though I did notice a letter went to Walter from a solicitor's office in the county town not 10 days back. Business letter, I should think, by the look of the envelope. Edith thanked her and walked home slower than she had walked there, turning this small fact over with the particular dread of a woman assembling a picture she very much did not wish to see completed. That evening she raised it with Walter directly, over a supper neither of them ate much of. There was a letter from a solicitor, Walter, 10 days ago. What did it say? Nothing that concerns you, Edith. Business. He did not look up from his plate. Everything about this shop concerns me. I have kept its books, badly as you'd have me believe, for 6 years, and I am telling you the figures do not add up, and now I hear there's solicitors writing to you, and your aunt was asking after you on the telephone not long before she died, and I am asking you plainly, Walter, what is going on? He set down his fork with a care that was its own kind of answer. I have borrowed against some stock. It is being managed. I did not want to worry you over something I have well in hand. How much, Walter? He told her, and the figure was bad enough that Edith put down her own fork and sat for a long moment, simply looking at her husband across a table that had, until that moment, felt like a reasonably solid piece of furniture in a reasonably solid life. And Aunt Constance, did she know? I don't know what she knew. This at least was a true answer, though not an honest one, since Walter knew rather more than he was willing to say about what his aunt had overheard on the telephone 3 weeks before, and what changes she had been arranging to make because of it. Edith did not ask him anything further that evening, though something in the set of her face suggested she had begun, privately, to count back the days between the solicitor's letter and Constance's death, and did not entirely like the sum she arrived at. The talk of the shop's failing fortunes reached the bar of the Crown by way of Mrs. Fruin, the doctor's housekeeper, who had heard it from Edith's own sister in passing and repeated it to Tom Buckle while collecting the doctor's evening pint. The Greers are in difficulty, Tom. Edith's been at her wits' end over the accounts, I hear, and spending more than they've got coming in besides. New curtains for the front room only last month, and a new bicycle for the boy. By the time this had gone twice round the public bar, it had settled into the comfortable, easily digested shape that village gossip generally preferred, that Edith Greer spent too freely, and Walter, poor man, was simply trying to keep pace with her, a version of events that placed the blame squarely where the village found it easiest to place such things, on a wife's housekeeping rather than a husband's private arrangements, and which had the added inconvenience, as far as anyone seeking the truth was concerned, of being almost entirely backwards. Inspector Reeve, who had been called in once a second look at Dr. Sandys's notes, raised a question or two about the contents of that second cup, heard this version of the story from Tom Buckle himself on his first evening in the village, and noted it down in his book, under Mrs. Dunnow, suspect, motive unclear, and the Greer household, financial difficulty, wife spending, without troubling himself further to ask which half of that sentence was the truer one. Chapter 9. Gloves. Indoors. It was Inspector Reeve's arrival, and the confirmation that followed it within 2 days that Constance Pebmarsh had died not of a weak heart alone, but of a substantial quantity of digitalis administered shortly before her death, that turned the village's idle talk into something with rather sharper edges. Foxglove, Dr. Sandys told the inspector, with the particular grim precision of a man correcting his own earlier diagnosis. The symptoms mimic a heart attack closely enough that I missed it entirely, and I have treated that woman's heart for 15 years. I should have looked closer. I did not, because I had no reason to expect anything but what I found. And foxglove is easily had, Doctor. In this village, Inspector, you could not turn round in a garden in May without finding a stand of it. Half the cottage borders are full of it. It needs no more than a strong tea made from the leaves, properly judged in quantity, and a teapot already in the room to disguise the taste in. Inspector Reeve was a solid, careful man, much given to following the evidence in the order it presented itself to him, which meant that his first and most settled theory, once foul play was confirmed, attached itself to Mrs. Dunnow, the newcomer with no long history in the village to soften suspicion, seen near the cottage on the day in question, with no satisfactory explanation beyond a library book that nobody but Constance herself could now confirm. He called on her formally on the Friday, and Mrs. Dunnow, white-faced and frightened in the particular way of someone who has done nothing wrong and finds for the first time in her life that this is no protection at all, answered his questions as steadily as she could manage, which was not, in the inspector's private estimation, quite steadily enough. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had gone to help with the flower arrangements for the show, which proceeded that Saturday, despite everything, since Constance herself, the committee agreed, would have considered any postponement a far greater discourtesy to the village than her own death had been. It was in the church hall, among buckets of cut stems and the particular organized chaos of a flower show morning, that she noticed Hartley's hands, gloved even at this close, fiddly work, cutting and arranging a tall stand of foxgloves that had been brought in, by general village custom, for the show's wildflower display. "You're very careful with those, Hartley." "Always glove up for foxglove, miss. Old habit from my father, who gardened before me. Sap on bare skin can give you a nasty rash if you've any sensitivity to it, and some folk don't know they've got the sensitivity till they've got the rash." He set the last stem in place. Funny thing to think of, given what's happened, but there it is. Old habits don't change just because the reason for them turns out to matter more than you ever thought it would. Miss Marple watched his gloved hands for a moment longer than the remark strictly required, and something in the back of her mind, which had been turning over a small loose fact for some days without quite finding the place it belonged, turned over once more and settled. She had seen those same careful gloved hands once before, recently, in a context that had nothing to do with gardens at all. Walter Greer, behind his own counter at the ironmonger's, had been wearing his gloves the day after Constance died, indoors, in the shop, on a warm morning when no one else in the village had any earthly reason to keep their hands covered. She had thought nothing of it at the time beyond a vague, unexamined impression that it seemed an odd habit for a shopkeeper. She thought a great deal more of it now. "Hartley," she said carefully, "when did you last give Mr. Greer any cuttings from this garden? Or sell him anything from the foxglove bed, in the course of his business?" Couldn't say as I have, miss. Not directly, though he's been up to the cottage a fair bit these last weeks, more than usual, and I shouldn't think Miss Pebmarsh ever counted her flowers close enough to notice if a stem or two went missing from a bed right by her own kitchen door. Miss Marple thanked him and went to find a chair to sit in, which she did not often need in the ordinary run of things, but which she found, on this particular morning, to be entirely necessary, since the small loose fact had finally found the place it belonged, and the shape it made, once it had settled there, was not a comfortable one. Chapter 10. The Missing Recipe Book. Miss Marple did not go to Inspector Reeve directly. Not yet. She had learned, over a great many years and a great many villages, that an inspector handed a name without proof generally did one of two things, neither of them useful. He either dismissed it as an old woman's fancy, or he acted on it too soon, frightening the guilty party into silence or, worse, into flight, before the proof that would actually convict him had been properly gathered. What she needed was something to bring Walter out into the open, and for that she needed the village itself, which she had watched operate for the better part of a week with a speed and thoroughness that no inspector, however careful, could hope to match. She went first to Reverend Tolt on the Sunday after the show, ostensibly to discuss the flowers that had been left over and might be used to decorate the church for the following week. "I wonder, Reverend, whether you might make a small announcement at the end of the service. Nothing alarming. Only that Constance's recipe book has been found, mislaid among her papers rather than lost, and that the Flower Show Committee intends to look through it for her notes on the show's traditional teas, since she always kept the most particular records of such things." "Has it been found, Jane?" "Not as such, no. But I think it very likely to be found by someone before the week is out, and I should like the village to be thinking about it before that happens rather than after." Reverend Tolt, who had known Miss Marple long enough to recognize when a request of this kind was not quite what it appeared to be, asked no further questions and made the announcement as requested, in the mild, unremarkable tone of a man passing along a small piece of parish housekeeping, and thought no more of it himself, though a good many people in the congregation that morning thought a great deal more of it than he could have guessed. The announcement reached Walter by the usual circuitous village route, by way of his wife, who had heard it from Mrs. Tolt at the church door and mentioned it to him over Sunday dinner with no particular weight attached to it at all. "They've found Aunt Constance's old recipe book, apparently. Going to look through it for the show notes." Walter set down his knife and fork with rather more care than the remark seemed to call for. "Found it where?" "I don't know, Walter. Among her papers, I suppose. Why does it matter where?" "It doesn't matter. I only wondered." But it mattered to Walter a great deal, because he remembered, with the particular clarity of a man recalling the worst afternoon of his life, that his aunt had been in the habit of jotting odd domestic notes into the back pages of that very book, recipes for cordials and remedies alongside her recipes for jam, and he could not for the life of him be certain, sitting at his own dinner table with his wife, watching him with an attention he had not earned, whether somewhere in those pages his aunt might have written down something about the foxglove bed by her kitchen door, or about a conversation overheard on the telephone, or about a nephew's visits grown suddenly more frequent than they had any business being. He told himself, for the rest of that Sunday and most of Monday, that there was nothing in the book to find, that he was alarming himself over an old woman's jam recipes. He told himself this right up until Monday evening, when Mrs. Tolt, calling at the shop for a length of garden wire, mentioned in passing that the committee meant to go through the cottage thoroughly on Tuesday evening to find the book properly, since nobody had yet turned it up among the papers already searched. Tuesday evening, then. The cottage would be empty until then, the key still held, as everyone in the village knew, beneath the third flower pot by the back door, where Constance had kept it for 30 years, out of a stubborn refusal to be troubled by anything so modern as having a spare cut for the doctor or the cleaning woman. Inspector Reeve, briefed that afternoon by Miss Marple in terms she had taken some care to make sound more like an elderly woman's harmless theory than the carefully constructed trap it in fact was, did not entirely believe her, but had learned enough of village ways in his few days in Little Hindwell to know that a thing confidently denied was often a thing worth watching for regardless. "You think he'll come for the book itself, Miss Marple? Seems a thin notion to build a watch on. I think, Inspector, that a man who has done what I believe Walter Greer has done will not be able to rest easy, not knowing what is, or is not, written in his aunt's own hand, about him, however unlikely it is that anything incriminating exists at all. Guilt does not require certainty to act upon. It only requires fear, and fear is a far less reasonable creature than certainty ever is." Reeve was not a man easily persuaded by talk of fear and guilt, as though they were facts, to be weighed like any other evidence. But he had a watch to spare, and a cottage standing empty, and there seemed little harm in placing a constable in the garden shed, with a clear view of the back door. And Dr. Sandys, who knew the cottage and its habits better than anyone living, agreed to sit with him through the evening, rather than leave the watch to a single pair of eyes. They did not have long to wait. A little after 10, with the lane dark and the village settled for the night, a figure came quietly up the back path, moving with the particular care of someone who did not wish to be seen, and had convinced himself, in the privacy of his own fear, that no one would be watching. Walter found the key beneath the third flower pot, exactly where it had always been, and let himself into the dark cottage with a torch shielded carefully against the window, and went directly to the small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room, where his aunt had kept her papers and her recipe book both, in the same drawer, for as long as he could remember. He was halfway through the drawer, the torch beam shaking very slightly in his hand, when Dr. Sandys turned on the sitting-room light from the doorway, and Inspector Reeve, who had come round by the front while the constable held the back, stepped in from the hall. "Good evening, Mr. Greer." The inspector's voice was entirely without drama, the voice of a man who had done this kind of thing many times before and felt no particular need to make a performance of it now. "Rather a late hour for tidying your aunt's papers." Walter stood quite still for a long moment, the torch beam wavering across the carpet, and then, with the particular collapse of a man who has been holding himself upright by willpower alone for some days, and finds, quite suddenly, that the will to do so has simply run out, he sat down heavily in his aunt's own chair, the chair in which she had died, and put his face in his hands. "There's nothing in the book," he said, when he could speak again. "I see that now. There was never anything in the book at all. I have been afraid of a recipe for gooseberry cordial for 3 days." "What were you afraid was in it, Mr. Greer?" Inspector Reeve asked this quietly, with the patience of a man who recognized, finally, that the real conversation was only now beginning. Walter told him everything, in the end, with the particular relief of a man who has carried a thing alone for too long, and finds, even in the worst circumstances imaginable, some measure of comfort in finally setting it down where someone else can see the whole shape of it. The debts, the letter from the solicitor's office giving him a fortnight he did not have, the overheard telephone call 3 weeks before, the growing certainty that his aunt meant to cut him out of a will that was the only thing standing between himself and ruin, and the foxglove bed by the kitchen door that Hartley had so conveniently moved that spring, near enough to the house that a man calling on an ordinary errand might slip a few leaves into his pocket without anyone troubling to remark on it. He had made the tea from them himself, 2 days before, steeping the leaves in his own kitchen while Edith was at the W.I. Hall, and had carried the small flask of it to the cottage on his next visit, tipping it into the pot when his aunt left the room briefly to fetch a fresh batch of biscuits, timing it, without quite admitting to himself what he was timing it for, to take its full effect somewhere around the second cup, after he himself had safely gone. "I told myself it was her heart that would do the work," he said, very quietly, to the room rather than to anyone in it in particular. "I told myself I was hardly doing anything at all, only helping along something that was coming regardless. Nobody in the room troubled to correct this particular piece of self-deception aloud, since it scarcely required correcting, and Inspector Reeve, who had heard a great many such explanations from a great many frightened men over the years, simply nodded to the constable waiting in the doorway, and began, in the flat, unhurried voice of duty, to caution him formally. Chapter 11. What the Village Keeps. News of an arrest travels through a village a great deal faster than news of a death, since death, however sudden, has the decency to wait for a funeral before it asks to be discussed in full, whereas an arrest announces itself at once, complete and shocking, with no period of preparation allowed at all. By breakfast the following morning, there was not a household in Little Hindwell that had not heard some version of what had happened at the cottage the night before. And as always, the versions did not entirely agree with one another, or with the truth, though this time, for once, the broad shape of the thing was right, even where the details wandered. Walter Greer, Mrs. Sopworth said to her window, to nobody in particular, since there was nobody else in the room to hear her, though this had never in the past stopped her from saying things aloud regardless. Well, I never would have thought it of him, and yet, thinking back, there was always something in the way he kept his shop accounts so close to his own chest that I might have wondered, if anyone had asked me at the time, which nobody did. This was not, strictly speaking, true, since Mrs. Sopworth had wondered nothing of the kind before that morning, and had in fact spent the better part of the preceding week wondering a great many things about Mrs. Dunnow instead. But a village has a forgiving memory for its own wrong guesses, and by the end of that single day, nobody in Little Hindwell could quite recall having suspected anyone but Walter all along. Mrs. Dunnow received the news from Tom Buckle, who came round to her cottage himself, rather than let her hear it second-hand and badly, as he privately felt she had rather earned better treatment than the village had so far given her. "They've got the man who did it, Mrs. Dunnow. Walter Greer, if you can credit it. It wasn't you at all, and I'm sorry the talk ever went that way, truly I am. Thank you for telling me yourself, Mr. Buckle." Her relief was plain enough in her face, though it was tempered, as relief in such circumstances often is, by something harder underneath it, a tiredness at having been so readily suspected by people she had lived among, however briefly, for 2 years. "I don't suppose the village will trouble to apologize quite as loudly as it troubled to suspect me, but I find I am too glad of the truth to mind that very much today. Some of them might surprise you," Tom said, with more hope than certainty, and left it at that, since he was a publican rather than a prophet, and had learned not to promise more of human nature than he had any real evidence for. Edith Greer did not go to the police station that morning, nor the next, though she was told, by the constable who came to inform her formally of her husband's arrest, that she was welcome to do so whenever she felt able. She spent those first days instead in the shop itself, alone behind the counter, going through the real ledger and the bank's ledger side by side with a thoroughness her husband had spent 2 years successfully avoiding, and arriving, by the end of the second day, at a full and accurate picture of exactly how deep the trouble ran, and exactly how it might, with care and a great deal of work, be climbed back out of. "I should have looked closer sooner," she told Miss Marple, who had called at the shop on some small pretext of needing picture hooks, though both women understood perfectly well that the picture hooks were not the true reason for the visit. "I knew something was wrong. I simply did not want to know how wrong, because not knowing was easier to live inside than knowing would have been. That is a very common failing, Mrs. Greer, and not, I think, one you ought to judge yourself too harshly for. There is a great difference between not wanting to look and having done the thing yourself. You did neither. You only hesitated, which is what most people do, faced with a husband and a fear of what looking too closely might cost them. It has cost me everything regardless, looking or not looking." Edith said this without self-pity, simply as a fact she had already made her peace with. "But I find, now that the worst of it is known, that I would rather know the whole shape of a bad thing than go on living half inside a lie that was never going to hold together regardless of how carefully I avoided looking at it. She kept the shop open through that week and the next, restocking carefully against what the bank would actually allow rather than what Walter had been pretending the business could afford, and turned away with a quiet firmness that surprised several people who had known her only as Walter's rather retiring wife, 2 further offers of credit from suppliers who had not yet heard how thoroughly that particular well had already been drawn from. Within the month, the shop was smaller in its stock and its ambitions than it had been under Walter's management, but it balanced every week to the exact penny, which was more than it had done in 2 years under anyone else's hand. The inquest, when it came, was a brief and orderly affair, conducted with the particular dry thoroughness of a coroner who had heard the whole of the evidence already from Inspector Reeve and required only the formal record of it for his own books. Inspector Reeve gave his evidence clearly and at proper length, describing the investigation, the confirmation of digitalis poisoning, the discovery of the financial motive, and the arrest at the cottage, in terms that placed the credit for the whole exactly where the official record would always place it, with thorough police work and careful attention to the evidence, and made no particular mention, in his formal account, of an elderly spinster's small experiment with a recipe book and a Sunday announcement from the pulpit. He had, in private, said rather more to Miss Marple herself, calling at the vicarage the evening before the inquest to thank her properly, in terms a courtroom would never hear. "I'll not pretend I'd have got to him half so quick without your notion about the book, Miss Marple, and I'll say so to you plainly, though I shan't be saying it quite so plainly in my report tomorrow. It would not do, you understand, for the official record to credit a piece of village theatre arranged by a witness rather than evidence properly gathered by the investigating officer. I understand perfectly, Inspector, and I should not dream of asking you to put it otherwise. The truth of a thing and the official record of it have never been obliged to match exactly, in my experience, and I find I have very little appetite, at my age, for being mentioned in newspapers, regardless of how the credit falls. I am only glad the right man has been caught, and that Mrs. Dunnow may now go back to being merely a newcomer rather than a suspect, which is trouble enough for any woman to bear in a village like this one. You knew it was him a fair while before you came to me with it. I suspected it a fair while before I had anything worth bringing to you, Inspector, which is rather a different thing. A gloved hand on a warm morning is not evidence of murder. It is only a small fact that does not fit comfortably alongside the other small facts around it. And a village gives you a great many of those, if you are patient enough to wait for them to arrange themselves into something with a proper shape. The inquest returned its verdict in due course, and the local paper, when it reported the matter the following week, gave Inspector Reeve's thorough investigation the whole of its admiring attention, and made no mention at all of Miss Jane Marple, which suited her, by her own frequent account to anyone who asked, very well indeed. The flower show itself, having gone ahead the Saturday before any of this came to light, was judged in due course to have been a considerable success. Constance's exacting schedule having been followed to the letter even in her absence, a fact several committee members remarked upon, with the particular relief of people glad to have got at least one thing right in a week that had otherwise gone so badly wrong. Miss Allardyce's roses took second place in their class, a result she received with rather better grace than anyone had expected of her, and which she attributed, more than once over the following weeks, to having finally been judged fairly by someone other than Constance Pebmarsh, a remark that several people found in poor taste and repeated anyway, because it was, after all, the sort of thing that was simply too interesting not to repeat. Mrs. Sopworth resumed her place at her window within days, her attention already turning, by the second week of June, from the matter of Walter Greer to a new and pressing question regarding whether the railway closure rumoured for the local station might or might not finally come to pass, a subject she discussed with anyone who passed close enough to her window to be drawn into it, with precisely the same confident authority she had so recently brought to the question of Walter Greer's guilt, a quality of certainty that the village had, by long habit, learned neither to fully trust nor entirely to dismiss. Polly Frith, asked some weeks later by her grandmother whether she remembered the van and the brown coat she had seen through the hedge, considered the question with the brief, practical seriousness children bring to matters that adults have suddenly decided are important, and said that she remembered it well enough, though she had been rather more interested, at the time, in whether her beetle had got away from her, which it had, and which she still, on the whole, minded rather more. Miss Marple, walking home through the lane behind the church on a warm evening near the end of June, paused for a moment by the gate of Constance's cottage, now standing empty and already a little overgrown, the foxglove bed by the kitchen door still flowering on, indifferent, as gardens generally are, to what use had once been made of them. She thought, not for the first time in a long life given over to noticing such things, how very little a village ever forgets, and how very little, in another sense, it ever quite remembers correctly either. The true shape of an event blurring within weeks into something more comfortable to live alongside, a stranger nearly blamed, a shopkeeper nobody had quite suspected, a flower bed that would go on flowering whatever anyone now chose to say about it. Two people in Little Hindwell, she supposed, Edith Greer behind her newly balanced ledger, and Mrs. Dunnow walking her bicycle past windows that no longer quite trusted her without reservation, would carry the true weight of that week, rather longer than the rest of the village troubled to, and there was nothing to be done about that, beyond what had already been done, which was, in the end, simply to find out what had actually happened, and to see that the right person answered for it. She walked on toward the vicarage in the last of the light, past Miss Hatching's darkened post office and Tom Buckle's lit windows at the Crown, past Mrs. Sopworth's house, where a curtain twitched briefly at her passing out of nothing more than old habit, and thought, with the particular tired satisfaction of a long day properly finished, that a village kept its secrets rather badly in the end, however well it believed it kept them, and that this, on the whole, whatever inconvenience it caused along the way, was very much for the best. The end.